Okay. Um, so what are some things that you learned when you were a miniature painter before you switch over to canvas painting that are bad for the archival stuff?
So the main one that I think is most applicable is the overuse of like flow improving agents, right? Like in the context of acrylics, it was water, right? Um, if we do that to oil, it'd be like adding too much oil, right? To have a proper like the amount of pigment to binding medium is actually a ratio that has a range where you get the best results from,
Yeah.
right? So if you add too much oil to oil paints with too little pigment, you will not get a proper binding ratio of pigment to binder. This can have, I mean, a multitude of effects. Like I think with miniature paintings, I used to have a lot of problems with like paint rubbing off if I was touching with my finger too much, right?
Yeah.
Um, so it's not a very strong bond. Um, that is probably a close one, but obviously, if you're also mixing media can have its own issues. Like we discussed before with like painting acrylic over oil, right? Negatively affects the acrylic. The acrylic will delaminate, no doubt, and the oil, it will negatively affect the oil beneath it. That's I think less common, but it's gained a decent amount of popularity though in the miniature painting world of mixing two media. Um, yeah, it generally has a lot of things to do with what you mix into the paints, and not keeping that ratio, right? So the equivalency of an oil is using like solvents. Solvents in canvas can be have a serious negative effect with the amount of oil available to bind with the pigment as well. Um, but with acrylics, I know less about acrylics as a binder overall. But as far as drying properly, I would probably stick to making sure that you have a decent ratio of pigment or an adequate ratio. Decent is the wrong word. Adequate ratio of pigment to binder. Um, don't use like semi-dried paint as well. This goes for oils too. Um, but yeah, and not to mention just like your pigment choice,
Yeah.
right? I never paid attention to that in miniature, but just using pigments that are light fast, light fast and stable. Miniatures get like they have a lot of you touch miniatures all the time, right?
Yeah.
Oil paintings, you don't have to deal with that as much, but that is also an effect of the binder and pigment, how well they can hold up to stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, so I think just understanding that like how much you can improve your like results and like the robustness of what you create with paying the same amount of money and not necessarily doing any extra effort outside of the effort of gaining the knowledge on what you are actually using. And it can be very positive because just in the oil paint field alone, most people have very little to no knowledge of the materials, and it will negatively affect the result or the how long their paintings last.
Oh yeah.
Um,
The and a lot of miniature paints will use more fugitive pigments. Like Chimera is releasing a new set that has PY14 in there. PY14, if you don't know, has a light fastest rating of ASTM 4.
it's that bad, huh?
Yeah.
There's not a lot of pigments that go that low.
Fluorescent blue is one of them.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Don't paint with fluorescents
Yeah.
if you want them to last any decent amount of time.
Oh yeah. Fluorescent blue is the best one. That lasts what? A minimum of 2 weeks in museum settings, while the other ones are 1 week.
Yeah, they're terrible.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, like learning that, like, we had the previous question about discoloration, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there are companies that still might use colors that discolor frequently. I told you there's that Instagram company Gapka, um, that makes fluorescent oil paints, and like they're like, if you knew nothing about pigments, which a ton of people don't, you would think, oh, that's really cool. Like I'm gonna paint with those, and they might even like how they paint with, and then they'll might forget about their painting. They'll come back in a year, and it's like the color is gone.
Mhm.
It's like, why the hell did I even bother with this?
Yeah.
Because like and don't get me wrong, if fluorescents were perfectly light fast, I would probably use them on my palette.
They're gorgeous colors.
Yeah,
Which there is actually a light fast fluorescent orange.
yeah. I think you were telling me about
Yeah,
that one
it's
before.
Pyranone orange.
Yeah.
Uh, PO 43, I believe. Yeah, it's black light reactive, fairly bright. I'll just show it on camera here.
Yeah.
That orange from Golden, PO 43.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, it's used a lot in
But
safety
yeah,
equipment.
so yeah, with the original thing though is, that's probably the biggest problem is like overall in painting in general, not just miniature, is just people not knowing about their pigments, right? Like when I first started painting, I was using alizarin crimson. I don't know what the proper pronunciation for that. And I saw people using Prussian blue. I've used Prussian blue. I've used uh I wouldn't know zinc white is a problem. I wouldn't know, dioxazine purple. I thought dioxazine purple was light fast up until like 8 months ago. It was actually fairly recent. I found out about
Yeah,
dioxazine
same
purple.
here. I thought it was light
Uh,
fastness one.
yeah,
Yeah.
I thought I actually vouched for it before, because it's like, as like if I had to use a purple paint, would you I like dioxazine like probably the best, because like it is fairly strong tinting, and it's saturated, right? And but yeah, not anymore.
PV 55, quinacridone purple.
Yeah, see, that's
That's
one
light
I'm
fast.
probably going to use
Yeah.
in the future, or not use regularly, but like when I start making my oil paints, for people, I'm probably going to offer quinacridone purple.
Yeah. It's expensive, but it's blue will skill 8 on everything. That being
Yeah,
said, there are two different dioxazine violets, and one is more light fast than the other.
that is interesting when you get like the variations, because isn't that the same with, well, you told me about a phthalo blue that wasn't light fast, right?
Yeah.
um and wasn't one of the greens also not light fast?
Yeah, but that was one of the older versions of it. That
The
no
older
longer.
versions, okay.
Yeah. There's a phthalo blue that has some fading issues, and it's used in printer ink.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Um.
Well, and this goes to show you too, like even like pigments that, like, if we're just talking about similar like of like chemical formulation and names, right? That even that has like variation in it too, that you just need to be aware of, right? Before you, like, that you ought to be aware of, right? Before you make your choices on colors that you use. And also this all becomes much, like, actually getting back to miniature painters, of like, and I think you talked about this, where like mixing is discouraged, mixing colors, but there is so much power in getting to use strong saturated single pigment paints and mixing them to get the colors that you want,
Yeah.
right?
And
I can't go on enough about that.
now there is one thing actually. Of mixing. Some pigments do have fading issues with titanium white when you mix them together.
Really? Which ones?
PO 73 Pyro Orange.
Pyro orange does.
Yeah.
Interesting. That,
Some.
what that might relate to is, this goes back to the titanium yellowing thing.
Yeah.
And this was not verified, but some people think that why titanium white yellows as much as it do has to do with a slow separation of the oil and pigment.
Mhm.
And they think it might have to do with something with like the molecular weight of the pigment itself. And I'm curious if that's another thing here, or if that could be related in this context as well. Titanium white seems to have some unique properties um, relative to oil, I guess. Or other, I imagine that also is true though in acrylic.
Yeah, it's so. I mean, despite it mixing weirdly, not like white, uh,
Hmm.
it does have some weird properties with acrylic,
Yeah.
which
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
speak a little fun fact actually, that most people don't know. This has nothing to do with being archival. It's just a little fun fact. White plastic uses titanium white, but it also uses cobalt violet. In order to
Huh.
look white, you put a little bit of cobalt violet in there.
Well, remember I told you titanium white mixes like a blue that leans purple too.
Yeah.
And but cobalt violet is on the warm side though, right? It's on the slightly warm, which would
It
be interesting.
can have a couple of different versions of it here. Like this is one version here that's cooler.
Yeah.
That's
Still more red than I would expect.
yeah, it's cobalt caprice, and then you have a different version of it right here. I have a lot of versions of cobalt violet because it's such a rare color now. That's more
Yeah.
blue.
Yeah, that one is.
Yeah.
Yeah, see that one, that one on the right is much closer to what titanium white mixes like than the one on the left, in my
Mhm.
opinion.
Yep.
And not to mention the opacity of titanium white kind of messes with mixing so much too.
And I have a third version of it here that is definitely way more warm or way more blue than the rest of them.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That
The,
one on the left has the most value in mixing in general, in my opinion. But
they're all still very pretty colors.
I mean, they're gorgeous.
Yeah. This
It's
was
just it's a shame that it's just not a very usable pigment in general.
nah, it's super low tint strength.
Yeah, like its use is basically only if you're painting with a straight color,
Pretty much.
essentially.
Which is rare for oil painters.
Very, yeah, very. It comes up with whites. It comes up with yellows. The occasional red and flowers,
Mm-hmm.
but like the cold colors, especially in representational painting, like realism, greens, blues, purples, they just don't come up in that saturation.
Nah. Still, it's a neat color. And a little bit of fun
Yep.
fact, just because education. It's always fun. Uh and yeah. So what are some other things though? That mini painters, canvas painters tend to do that aren't very archival.
Let's see. So painting with semi-dried paint has issues, right? So like if you um this is one thing that bothers me with oil painters who don't clean their palettes. Like as you see me do, I clean my palette after every use. Having oil in different states of drying, essentially, because right, the surface has more exposure to air and air movement, right? Um, and then like reusing that paint can have issues with the formation of the oil film, because once again, having different, essentially, drying times of a non-homogeneous mixture can lead to like inconsistent drying of the oil beneath it and on top of it, which already happens, but it can exaggerate it a bit. And then it could also have bonding issues too. Um, that's one with oils. With acrylics, I would assume there would be some more issues, but since you have the quicker drying time or some similar issues, it wouldn't be as big of an issue. And wet palettes obviously help a lot with that if you're not using like the dry part of the top. Um, but God, what acrylic? Like I said, acrylics is tougher because it's a much like there's. I don't know how much mediums come into play with miniature painters outside of using water. Because like frankly though, using water is not great,
Yeah.
but
Uh
it's kind of mandatory though for the nature of how miniature painters paint. I
yeah.
guess not varnishing.
Varnishing helps a ton, yeah. It also can
Yeah.
make certain pigments pop a lot more as well.
Oh yeah. Well, like this is one thing I've ranted against a lot of oil painters for, and um, is if it goes unvarnished, the environment will dirty the paint layer, and it will get in there, and you can't get it off without removing the paint. So this is a big deal with like older oil paintings, right? Like especially around smokers and stuff. Is if it's not varnished, the only way to clean it is to remove a layer of paint. Now, how thin you can make that is part of it, right? But varnish acts as a sacrificial layer of protection to stop your painting from discolor. Now, varnish will discolor, but the beauty of it is you can remove the varnish without removing the paint if you need to do that. And then the big, like another great reason, and this is usually what, funny enough, this is what usually wins people over on this argument is varnish. You can use varnish to make your painting look better or your miniature.
Yeah.
Like there's like you could use different varnishes for different things. Like on a miniature, if you had like a shiny like shiny piece of armor or shiny weapon, you could use a different varnish on that area. It doesn't, and then use like a matte varnish on other things to even accentuate that difference, right? Um, but you can actively use varnish um, as a tool to make your paintings or miniatures look better.
Yeah.
And I was always hesitant with miniatures because like, oh, why even bother, right? Type thing. But then when I started actually learning about like how needed varnish is, varnish helps produce helps if you are using non-light fast pigments, you can use varnish that helps protect from UV.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
not
what?
all
Sorry.
yeah, so not all varnishes actually have a UVL in them.
Yep, I do know. Yep,
Yeah.
it does take some additional knowledge to know which ones can do that, right?
Yeah.
They have the different finishes. Um, but I strongly recommend in all applications where you're using paint for like preserving the beauty of what you did, right? Of using varnishes, also knowing that it is reversible. It's just
Mhm.
all reversible. And there might be some that aren't. Like if you dip something like, well, that's not necessarily a varnish, but like, some people will seal paintings in epoxy resin, which is its own problem. But like it has its own issues. But like I'm not recommending that ever. But yeah, it's another phase that can improve your results and protect your results. And it's just kind of a no-brainer. But you would be surprised um how much like fight I get back on that argument from
Oh,
oil painters.
oh yeah, no, they're constantly doing that, but there's also something in mind that that varnish also isn't the end all be all and won't be the saving grace for every single little thing too.
Of
It's really
course.
good for protecting your paintings from against the environment and against UV rays.
Yeah.
It
I mean, because yeah,
yeah.
if you painted with like zinc white or like painted like if you like painted with non light fast pigments or use pigments that negatively affect the oil layer or like the acrylic binding or yeah, it's not going to save that. If you had a lot of sinking in where there's not enough oil for the pigment, you're still going to have issues with that.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
it's just it's a culmination of all the practices together. You know what I mean? Like it's um like proper understanding of like fat over lean principles and making a robust painting that that like with just regular care or maintenance will last hundreds of years. Like a lot of these Renaissance paintings have lasted 600, I mean 500 years,
Mhm. Well, why should you care about it lasting that long? I'm not going to live to.
Now we're getting into ethics, right?
Yeah.
I'm in the opinion of ethically, if you're trying to sell a painting or um, creating something that ultimately you care about, you should take steps to make sure it stays in the way that you want it to be viewed and that people can view it. Like, I know a lot of my paintings are, not good or not like special or anything like that. But if I'm attempting to sell them, I want to make sure I'm providing a product that I'm proud of and that will last a long time. And like I said, I think that is just merely a statement about ethics, your ethics as a person and like a creator or an artist, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's still a valid question, but it's at the same time like, you know, uh, the the question that I always get from that is, well, how long should you care about it? Like, for instance, not using fluos is a good example because you'll see that within your lifetime, that the color change.
Oh yeah,
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 but like dioxazine violet, going back to that, where that's what an ASTM 2,
yeah,
blue wool scale 7 as a tint and a mixture. It is an 8 when it's on the flat color.
yeah. Well, I mean,
But
frankly, most pigments are eights on like when if you like you could have alizarin crimson in pure sunlight if you paint it with a thick layer of just pure alizarin crimson doesn't really fade,
yeah,
right? It's like when you mix it, when it's thinned out, when it's when there's not as much pigment prevalent, that's when like the problems occur, right?
yeah,
um and yeah, I like, you cannot care. I mean, like but it really like the thing is, you're not putting in more effort to make your paintings more reliable and robust, right? And I think that's why I also bring in ethics into this, right? So it's like if a car company said like, we're going to like, do we find it ethical? Here's a better example, right? Where like designed failure in components is like ethical or not. Like, it's not, right? Like, you know how like it started with basically cell phone batteries are kind of the most prevalent understanding that people have of it, like where you just had a cell phone battery and suddenly it just started to not be able to get charged. That's not because of something out of their control. They can make better batteries. They can make batteries that last longer. They designed functionality around a period to kind of influence you to get a new cell phone. Now, I'm not saying that's what we're doing with paintings, but I think we can easily question the ethics of that, right? Now, in painting, if we can do something that can ensure our painting could last as long as it can outside of our control, and we intend to sell it or make money off of it or to show it, I think with in the context of understanding less like how little effort that takes, I think it's something that is ethically correct to do.
hmm. Ooh, and we actually just got in more questions, by the way.
Okay, cool.
Uh, two more right here, maybe a third. If someone likes to work with a particularly thick impasto, uh, should they know to increase longevity?
Should they know? Sorry, can you repeat that for me one more
Yeah.
time?
If somebody likes to work with particularly thick impasto, what should they know to increase longevity?
What should they? Okay, so with thick impasto, is generally you're not going to have any issues with light fastness, like referring to our previous thing. Um, I'd say the biggest trouble you could get into is if you were using dryers with impasto. This relates to that like expanding upon the China dryers or Chinese dryer. It's China dryer or Japan dryers. I'm sorry, Japan dryers. Or using drying elements where if you had a very thick amount of paint and you had uneven drying between or you're using a dryer where the outside dries very fast, you could actually negatively affect the oil paint below that or the oil below that, and can cause a longer drying period. And you can have there's like phenomenons like what's it called? It's where oil actually comes out of the area below it, and you'll have oil streaks leaking from it. That is not very common, and that is usually in the presence of dryers. Okay. But it can also lead to cracking. If you have a very thick layer of paint and the top is dry and the bottom is not, where the forces generated by the paint contracting or expanding causes the upper layer to crack from the forces of the drying, just the drying alone. So I would recommend, if you're using impasto, to not or heavy impasto, to not use dryers. I would say just to avoid it. Never paint with solvent above it. Even if it's dry, I would not use like a solvents, and if it's fully dry, but oil never really like fully dries technically. But I'll say, as a just kind of a general, don't paint above it unless the paint is completely wet that you're painting into with impasto. And beware of how much medium you put in that. So if you're painting in thick impasto, I would highly recommend to stay as close as you can with the ratio of pigment to binder as what comes out of the tube.
Yeah. Let's see. We also has the long-term efficacy of non-absorbent grounds such as Michael Harding's been studied. Are oils any more likely to separate from such a surface?
This I don't have as much knowledge on, unfortunately.
Yeah.
However, I can state that with grounds and surfaces that you're painting on, the biggest thing I could say is avoid solvents touching those. Just use the oil. Because like, are you familiar with the phenomenon of like not phenomenon, but like the sinking in? Have you heard this term before?
I have not.
So sinking in is when an oil painter their painting will be dry and it will look matte. Okay, it will look matte on the surface in parts of areas where it didn't look like that before. And this happens a lot with people. This is one of the most common problems that people have, and they're like, why is it drying matte? And a lot of it has to do with solvents and the surface that you're painting on. So solvents will separate oil particles from each other. Okay, and the surfaces that you paint on have some level of porosity. And what happens is the oil will actually go into the pores of the surface away from your pigment. Like it will detract it from the oil around the pigment and go into the surface. So making your ratio of pigment to binder, or pigment to oil in this case, much higher on the pigment side, right? Less oil to pigment. And now there's not enough oil to properly bind the pigment around it. Okay. And this is partly why I don't recommend anybody using solvents pretty much ever, because most people do it on the first layer where this can occur the most. Now, there are measures to be taken to avoid this, like mixing in stand oil, where stand oil, even in the separated function, the molecules are generally too big for those pores. This is why stand oil can help prevent sinking in, right? Some people also do something called oiling out, which is they'll literally just take some oil, mix a solvent, and paint it over these areas that are dried with that are sunken in. I would highly recommend to avoid doing that if it's your final layer. Like, you don't want to put a layer of just pure oil over your pigment because it yields, and you won't be able to get it off, right? So there's not really ways to fix it after it's done. You just have to like make sure you varnish it to get back the shine. Sorry. Um,
I'm not.
and
I'm not editing that out. That's too much work.
My apologies. Yeah, it's all right. So yeah, it's just kind of like a culmination of good practices to help avoid those things. But so yeah, I mean, with surfaces, I just use gesso currently, and I'm going to, when I start making my own canvases. Well, I don't gesso. I use the store bought surfaces because um I'm not in search of like a finer surface like some people are. But those are commonalities between all of those, and or like with sinking in. Um, I'm going to be using lead ground when I start making my own canvases, but I also I don't use solvents in any of my paintings, so I don't have sinking in is not an issue for me. So yeah.
Oh, and this is actually kind of funny. We kind of already discussed this, but have UV varnishes advanced to the point where choosing pigments on the higher light facets only is less of a concern? Should even the fugitive still be avoided?
They should still be avoided.
Yeah.
It's always an issue because varnishes degrade. It's not
Mhm.
like you're gonna. It's like a permanent perfect shell. They discolor and they'll have to be changed. And they like it, and it's not perfect UV. It's not perfect either, right? like it's not something totally unavoidable. And then the follow up is there's you could find whatever pigment that you're using that's not light fast. You could find a light fast alternative.
Yeah.
At least from my understanding, right? The biggest one being and the most commonly used being alizarin crimson. There
Yeah.
are options outside of that.
Yeah, like anthraquinone red and stuff like that, which are
Yep.
similar. They're not exact, but they're similar enough to where you probably would never
Right.
notice.
And there's quinacronomes too, right? So
Mhm.
it's like, well, now granted, what's available is a little bit tougher, but I know quinacridone magenta is fairly readily available, so you are changing it a bit, but like but it's something like it's just the point of don't you don't need to fall in love with a pigment. There are different choices, and there are alternatives to make it work.
Yeah. Which I keep saying L is a garbage pigment used by garbage people for a reason. It it is genuinely not something like it's so common in watercolors though, and I don't get
It
it.
is.
Like
I
you make watercolors, I make water. You're my competitor.
Goddamn right I am.
You better not start
I'm
making
coming for you.
oils. Ugh.
uh,
God.
I
Yeah.
Once I get the machine, I'm making oils.
Well, I already own the machine,
Badly
so
maintained. Do you have
yeah.
a 3 mil roller?
I have a mini one. It's not good enough for making acrylics yet though.
Which one do you which one do you use, and how much did it cost?
It cost me like 4 grand.
It's
I
still 4 grand.
Yeah. I picked it up off AliExpress.
Damn.
Yeah. It was a while since I
I,
bought it too, so
I was hoping to be able to get one for like 2.
probably get a used one for 2. I have to buy a new one anyways. I have to buy one of the large ones for a project I'm working on. So yeah,
Gotcha.
because those actually can do acrylics fairly well. The mini
Yeah,
ones
thankfully I
suck
have
for it.
no plans on acrylics with that. So,
Yeah,
um, but just being able to make like 10 tubes of oil, like how many like 40 mil tubes do you think you can make on that in one go?
um, the mini ones I have,
Yeah.
I can make a in one go. I can make a 200 mil tube.
Okay. Yeah, so you can make 540s at
Yeah.
once. Because when I sell my oil paint, I'm only going to sell small tubes at least in the beginning, until I understand the demand. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Of but I was hoping that it could do like 400,
Yeah,
but that's not a
this
huge.
is an
Like,
old like cosmetic one. So
yeah, I mean that's what the small ones for paints, are were designed for. Are they using steel or ceramic rollers?
I think aluminum.
Aluminum. Really?
Yeah, it's not a good one.
Huh.
Yeah, it's nicked up as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the aluminum is just like there are pigments materially that are going to be harder than aluminum,
Like
and that's what's that?
sienna.
Well, yeah, all the iron oxides too.
Yeah, raw
Um,
sienna is what screwed mine up.
yeah. Like I don't know, bismuth might have a chance. Hell, titanium might have a chance at it. I don't know the strength characteristics of titanium dioxide though, but the iron oxides for sure will nick that thing up, or it'll make it look like it's frosted. You know.
Yeah, mine's just looking like it's frosted, which honestly is not a bad thing necessarily. It kind of does help with
Yeah,
grinding, but
I'm curious. Like you could also probably hand polish those.
Mhm.
Um,
I'm just gonna.
but you know, you also have to be.
I just want to buy a new
You
one.
just have to be aware of the wear. Yeah, I mean
Yeah,
that's the thing, right? If they're aluminum, the big benefit of aluminum is they're not that expensive.
yeah.
So, yeah. All right.
Is there anything you have to discuss? Because we
I
got.
mean, if there's anything that you think that that would be good to address.
Yeah, I think we're good for now.
Okay.
Yeah. So